Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'd like to welcome my guests for today. We have Mark Brown, certified speaking professional, who's an executive coach and world champion of speaking. We have Lisa Nichols, who is CEO of Technology Partners, an award-winning certified women business enterprise and host of the Something Extra podcast. And we have Robert Zaft, who's an ethics keynote speaker, executive leadership coach, corporate trainer, and author of The Right Way to Win. Thank you all for being with me today. And here is today's challenge. A medical supply company creates a surgical implant designed to stop seizures in patients with epilepsy and similar conditions. In beta testing, the implant proves effective in only 15% of patients, but for those patients, it is a miracle cure. However, because of the low success rate, it is not economically viable for the company to produce or market the device. Moreover, the company does not want the expense of maintaining the software system that monitors and regulates the implant. By disabling the system, those trial patients whose seizures have been eliminated will likely face the return of their symptoms, possibly worse than they were before. Does the company have an ethical obligation to maintain the software? The floor is open.
I think we should let the world champion go first, personally.
Thank you, Robert. At my age, I grew up in a ladies' first environment, but since the baton has been handed to me, I'll take first stab at it. Because at first look, I think there's some intricacies to the case. On the surface, they build it, it's effective in 15%. One of my questions becomes, well, for the 15% for whom it's working, were they made aware of the possibility that the software to maintain the treatment may be withdrawn from the market? And had they been made aware of it, would they have then made the decision to go ahead nonetheless? It seems to me that having provided a service, which again, I would assume comes with the assurance that we have software to maintain it once we have it, gives the organization an obligation to service those for whom they have provided the device in the first place. Because it seems to me on the surface that the individuals who accepted the treatment understood, we will treat you and we have software to maintain you. And then to be told, we saw we can't maintain it, seems to me unethical based upon my understanding of the situation at the moment. So my first thought is, if you gave me the treatment and I understood there's software to maintain it, you should maintain software for my treatment. It's my first thought.
That's a really interesting point, Mark. You're sort of a step ahead of where I was thinking, which is that the beta test was to see whether it works in the first place. There's a possibility that it would not prove effective to begin with, in which case the question of maintaining it would be irrelevant. So you've added an interesting layer to that situation.
I guess because I would think, being a beta tester, okay, so if I do this and it does work, how do I stay healthy? Well, we have software that we're in place to keep it going if it does prove to work. So I don't know what that conversation was or if that even took place. We have no evidence of that based on the scenario. But my brain went in that direction. If I do it and it works, how do you maintain it? We have software. Then, well, it's not enough. We can't maintain the software. Hang on, you told me you had software. What do you mean? That's my perspective at the moment. And since Robert threw the ball to me, I'll pass it back to him.
Well, Lisa, do you want to say something? I don't want to jump in.
Sure, absolutely, I will. Interesting, Mark. I love what you just said, but as I think about it, and I just know in business, there are different views of what's right and wrong, right? My personal view is, ethics is really about alignment with behaviors and what you believe, right? And so I happen to believe that doing for the greater good is a good thing. I also believe in the golden rule. But in this case, I'm thinking every business could be directed to do things for the greater good, but at the expense of possibly going out of business, right? So I look at this and I think, wow, to maintain the software, but you're maintaining that software at a loss, you are maybe helping one group, but then you're hurting another group. And then that would be the investors in the stock, people that took stock in the company. So, in my case, I don't believe that this company has an ethical obligation to maintain the software when they are operating at a loss. And that's my personal view.
I think Mark is right to begin with the question of, what does a contract say between the parties? Because an essential element of both clinical trials and medical care generally is informed consent. And so we have to, I'll make some broad assumptions, which is I assume that if this was a standard clinical trial, that there were disclosures that this actually could be very harmful and people might die as a result. And that probably it doesn't establish a patient-physician relationship. And that's important because if you take a step back from this, you have a couple of issues. One is the physicians generally have an obligation for continuity of care. And in this particular case, so my guess would be that in the context of a clinical trial, it's not really care, it's a trial, it's an experiment. And so I think that would be understood. And so here, I also believe Lisa has a great point, which is we don't expect people to work for free. And the fact is that if the world's greatest surgeon can save people's lives, but demands a fee that's above what most people can pay, we don't oblige him to start operating for free or a discounted price. And it's similar in the larger world of medicine and the pharmaceutical world, which is ability to pay is one way in which we ration scarce resources. So that to me is the narrow question, but there's, I think, a better and broader question is what should you do? In other words, you can stick to your narrow ethical guns, in my view, and we'll assume in Mark's case that there was no contractual obligation expressed or implied to continue a successful trial procedure. But then I would say the issue now is not just what's ethical, but what should the company do? Because there's behaviors beyond ethics that are extremely relevant to maximizing the returns to shareholders that Lisa mentioned. I think that's my 2 minutes plus, so I apologize.
Well, of course, whenever we get into these types of discussions, we do need to delineate between what's legal and what's ethical. There's little question in my mind that the companies have written up contracts that have been devised by lawyers who have anticipated every possible contingency. And they don't allow themselves to get into situations where there is any legal obligation that they would not be willing to take on. But that being said, that their contract presumably covers them from whatever they may not want to do. But now that they've provided a cure for a small but significant population, and of course, the first rule of medicine is do no harm. Now, by withdrawing that, by making it unsustainable, are they not in fact doing harm? On the other hand, Lisa, your point is absolutely correct that they're a business. And that for the business to survive and continue to help others, they're now in a perhaps untenable position.
I think there is a distinction between conventional US medical ethics and traditional Jewish ethics on this point. If you look at the AMA guidelines, they say that there's no ethical difference between the denial of care and the withdrawal of care, which is my understanding, not the case of at least some traditional Jewish ethics, which says, look, you don't have to turn the machine on for the person, but once you turn it on, you can't switch it off. So there are different ethical approaches to this. I'm arguing for something broader than ethics, but we can wrestle with the ethics right now, which is this a continuity of care issue? And the fact is it's a clinical trial, first of all. And secondly, the ethics of doctors is to arrange for the continuity of care, but I don't think you become someone's indentured servant for life or canonical slave once you start treating them. And so I would think that there's a stronger argument is to say that the company doesn't have to continue treatment unless the situation Mark suggested, which is there's an express or implied obligation in the contract. But since the rabbi is setting the rules, and he said, let's assume this is probably a standard clinical trial contract, and that there's probably been a legal waiver of the obligation to continue any treatment if it's successful.
Right. And you know, maybe there's a different question though that the company could ask themselves. Maybe there is a different way to continue to do research, maybe through a joint venture with another organization or, you know, federal funding. I mean, maybe there is a way for them to, you know, even be able to help a broader base than the 15% by, you know, maybe there's a different question there that they should be asking themselves.
That's wise. Okay, go ahead, Robert. Go ahead.
No, please, Mark. After you.
Yeah, I think that's wise to explore. It's easy for us to say, okay, it's either you cut it off or you don't. But wisely, Lisa is saying, is there a broader option to be considered? And I tried to put myself in the place of the decision maker at the company. He says, okay, we can't sustain treating 15% who have had success, because even if we do, at some point, we're no longer able to sustain this. And one could easily say, well, you know what? We're gonna have to stop anyway. But if we stop now, at least we can work on other programs. We can do additional research and maybe find a better way to service not 15, but 55 or 85%. Is it worth our while to risk going bankrupt, trying to save them, when we could explore other avenues, go back to the table, and perhaps find something that would last longer than 3 months or 6 months? That may be worth it. What looks like the greater good now may not be the greatest good if we give ourselves a chance to reassign some funds, reassign some brain power, and we can help more people down the road. And hopefully when we do that, we will still have enough time to bolster the 15% and get them out of danger rather than simply going bankrupt and saying we're done. Food for thought.
Well,
Rabbi is nodding.
I think you make an excellent point here. If you're going to do a cost benefit analysis, and this is something Lisa also mentioned, you have to say, what are the opportunity costs to continuing this treatment? Because the funds that go into this are not going to go into things that might affect a larger group of people and give them even greater benefit. And this is this tugs at the heartstrings, because you can see people who've had a wonderful, miraculous result. I think it's been described. It seems to me that if I were advising the company, what I would say is, look, don't stop immediately. What you can do is you can license the rights to the software and the device to a charitable organization that you establish, and you can give it 60 or 90 days, some reasonable period, to see if there's enough public support to fund this charitable organization. And that way you retain the ultimate rights for the intellectual property, which might be more valuable down the road. You have a carve out for people currently getting the treatment, but you've put it in a 501c3. And what you're really saying is, if this is an important societal good, then we should spread the cost across society or across people who are in a position to provide the funding, either because it's what they're set up to do as a public charity or private charity, or because they want to. So that's why I would say that even broader than ethics is what's sensible. And in the context of businesses that worry about their reputations and that want to help people, that faced with this dilemma, I would probably move towards saying, find or create a charitable foundation, license the rights in, fund for some reasonable transition period, and see if the people involved can generate the funds from, as Lisa said, either government, a private foundation, or maybe some of the people themselves. That's how I would approach the problem, to say, ultimately the question is, what are we going to do about this, right? Because there's legal, there's ethical, and then there's what's sensible. And that has to take into account your business reputation, since this is a hypothetical involving a for-profit business.
You know, and I would modify what you're suggesting, Robert, and say that what's ethical and what's sensible go hand in hand. Looking for the solution, and Lisa, you really kicked this off by pointing out what we often come to is that we get into ethical dilemmas because we're fixed at seeing things in a binary way.
That's right.
Either you turn it off or you keep it going and you take the financial loss, but the creativity of looking for third ways, alternatives, compromises, create out of the box suggestions. There are sensible options that allow us to be ethical in ways that we can't be if we're locked into a binary way of looking at things.
I think
And
sadly
I think
we
that's the challenge. I think that's the challenge for all of us, right? Is to broaden our minds and not just think that there is one way or, you know, this way or that way. Dr. Jason Selk, which Rabbi Goldson, you may know, but, you know, he wrote the book Relentless Solution Focus. And he said that there is always a solution, but most people give up before they get to that, you know, to the solution. So you can have a problem-centric thinking, or you can be solution-focused. And I think that's the challenge for all of us in these different scenarios, right? There's just not an A or a B. There could be an X, Y, and Z.
I think all too often we are accustomed to the either or. I grew up with either or. You know, at 61 years old, I've got to rethink a lot of the either ors I've learned growing up. And that was so wise of you to say that, Lisa. It isn't always either or. And maybe a more humorous note, I can consider a company considering, okay, who do we consult with for public relations and marketing, so we can make people aware that we are trying to find solutions and get people on board. And very often we don't think of the marketing piece, or the PR piece, but that would also could require a considerable part of your budget to make people aware of what they're trying to do and get the message spread worldwide. So I really appreciate Robert's suggestion as well. It seems to me that it would involve several moving parts, but the beauty of it is it indicates action that is not purely a left or a right turn. It isn't either going forward or going backwards. So for me, the biggest aha so far, it doesn't have to be either or, left or right, front or back. And the more we expand our thinking, what possible options may be available to us, I think the more likely it becomes that the heads, as in brains, involved in tackling the idea, being free to, as you say, Lisa, think differently, may actually come up with additional options that were not initially considered. You go from left, right to, okay, what about diagonally here? What about here? And I think it's possible, even likely, that with a team of individuals tackling this and any such thorny issue, we can come up with several options that may not have to be immediate and dire as they may seem. That's a concept, no big
Very well
answers
said.
there, but it does make me think. So
Very well said, Mark.
If you remember, after Katrina, while the government was, various aspects of the government were wringing their hands and trying to figure out what to do, Walmart filled up a truck with bottled water and shipped it down to New Orleans. Now, if they hadn't done that, I don't think anybody would have said, well, how come Walmart didn't send water down to New Orleans? They didn't charge anybody for it, but the goodwill, I mean, aside from the humanitarian element, and let's give them the benefit of the doubt that that was their intent, but the goodwill and the branding advantage from doing such a thing. Very obvious. You were discussing this, Mark, that to do something that is philanthropic even if there may be a financial loss, and perhaps that can be mitigated through some sort of a partnership, but the the goodwill that you earn and the branding, what it does for your brand, there are tangible benefits there.
It's
But they-
priceless.
Yeah.
Rabbi, that's priceless. It
There you
really
go.
is. And shows that Walmart, shows that they have heart, that it's not just about the bottom line. So, yeah.
I think that also speaks to what Robert said when he mentioned 501c3 and inviting those who would be willing to help. Maybe I'm being a little bit Pollyannish here, is that a word, in this day and age? But I'm sure there are individuals, organizations who would get on board. Let's help you find a solution. Let's do what we can to sustain that 15% while we can, while you work on some other solution or additional means of serving the greatest good, so to speak. And I believe there are individuals, organizations who do think and who will act in that way. We have seen Hollywood superstars who are willing to go to a foreign country and make sure they have water because they have the resources to do so. And I'm sure there are individuals, some who are very wealthy and some who are not, who would get behind something of that nature because they realize it helps preserve human life. And I
Mhm.
think there has to be some faith in our fellow man to believe that there are those who be willing to do what they can to sustain life in a case like that. So I really like what Robert said about getting a foundation together or a charity. That certainly is a viable option.
We have to accept the fact that at the end of the day, not enough money might not be raised.
True.
But I think what the company has done is it has broadened the reputational challenge, broadened the reputational risk, and in a sense reformulated the question, because now it can say, look, it cost us so many tens of millions of dollars to create the technology. We did the clinical trial. We're going to provide this for free for all the people who were affected, but more funds are necessary than we can provide. Show us this is an important issue in saying to society, show us it's important. There's an orphan drug law that Congress passed for pharmaceuticals for diseases that have relatively small number of afflicted people, but very dire consequences. And so part of what you're trying to do is not just move away from a yes, no, or left, right, I think as Mark said, but you're trying to recontextualize the question so it embraces more than just the company. And now from an ethics standpoint, if all of this is just pure Machiavellian cunning, you could argue that it's not ethical. It violates deontological reasoning or sort of golden rule type reasoning, because you're trying to pretend to be somebody you're not, and any form of deception is unethical. On the other hand, if you look from cost benefit standpoint, if the utility is positive, then it's a good. Doesn't matter what your intentions were. And certainly anyone who gets extended treatment in the 15% doesn't really care about the motivations of the people. They just care about getting their continued treatment. So it's interesting because I view it as it's an ethical issue which is nested inside of a larger business question. And so the question back to the rabbi is sort of, how did you conceive of the hypothetical? Is it a pure ethical question, or is it a nested ethical question inside of a business conundrum? Because that's typically how the world I work with is business people have to make decisions.
Well, sure, and that's really why it's so relevant. I mean, I saw this as a scene in a medical show, and I thought it was particularly compelling because you do have that conflict between good business practice and human suffering. And there's not always, I mean, what we've tried to do here is explore possible ways where both can be served. Sometimes that may not be realistic. And that's, sometimes you just have to live with the realities. You can't fix every problem.
Right.
Right.
But the ethics of business, it's one of my pet peeves, and I talk about this in my keynotes, my training. The problem with compliance is that by effectively what you're trying to do is you're trying to legislate ethics. And it's a necessary first step, but it's inadequate. And in some ways it can be counterproductive, because as soon as I say I'm in compliance, now I can abdicate any responsibility for thinking further about what should be done, what could be done, what might be done. And that can turn us into less ethical people while we are complying with the laws that are designed to create an ethical culture.
Well, a question, compliance at one level sets a floor, not a ceiling, in terms of
And
how
that's how it should be. That's how it should be.
And
It doesn't always work that way, though.
you also run into the limits of language and the limits of process control and the limits of definition. So, and that is if you start, as our society has moved away from recognizing good manners and politeness and gentlemanly behavior or ladylike behavior, which was a soft and squishy or fuzzy area, but it was in a sense self-moderating, to the point where we don't have those norms or those goals anymore because they're too gender-based or gender fixed or objectifying or antedated, whatever. As you try now to encapsulate the norms in the language of compliance, you realize that you're creating a lot of problems. You might be solving some, but you're also creating others. And this goes to the alignment point that Lisa made, I think, at the beginning of her comments, which is you're trying to align people's personal incentives with the goals of the organization or the goals of the society. So how you choose that alignment is very important, because as Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And as Warren Buffett said, culture more than rule books determines how an organization behaves. And so I agree with the rabbi, which is that if you drive everything down to the level of compliance, you're not going to get the kind of behaviors you want, because it's all mandated, as opposed to saying, how do I align incentives? How do I affect people's view of themselves by the culture in which people are operating? And that's really where the ethics is going to live or die. It's not going to live or die in the compliance, because people are just too sneaky, and it's just too hard to create rules. And then what you find out, and you can see this from our highly regulated environments, is the regulators end up acting unethically. So
as I think of the scenario, though, my brain is asking a simple question. Okay, we realize it is untenable to maintain the software to serve the 15. And I'm just adding a question to reinforce Lisa's idea. If we in these dilemmas of this ilk will say, well, we can't sustain, what can we do? What can we do? And that stimulates the conversation away from, okay, we can't do this or we can't do that, because either way it's going to be a loss for them or for us. Well, what can we do? And maybe asking that question when faced with dilemmas of can't or two polar opposites, if that becomes, maybe for me, and I speak for Mark Brown, if that becomes a benchmark question, a go-to question, what can I do viably to maintain my ethics, to maintain my integrity, to serve those who I promised to serve? What can I do? Then maybe I'll start to think I will align myself with a few wiser heads, maybe Rabbi Jonathan Golson, to find out what, because sometimes someone else's vantage point, their head is clearer, it's less muddled, and they can. I ask my wife at times, because I'm so close to it. I only see the black and the white, and I need to grapple with the gray. See what I did there, honestly?
I saw that. I didn't.
I did that for you, right? So what can we do? Maybe a starting point.
Yes,
Yeah,
I love
and that's
that.
that prompts a number of thoughts, which I'm going to say for the next segment, because we are at the end of the first segment. But the point you're making here, Mark, is that ethically we should consult others. One, for the reason that you clearly articulated, is that we are too close to many things we don't see objectively when they relate to us. And the other broader perspective is that, all of us are smarter than any of us. And
Absolutely.
often the answer is in the room. And if we engage in the discussion and we probe, we can find that either the answer is already there or we can come to it together. And therefore, the ethical way is to explore new avenues and to communicate and to entertain possibilities that at first glance may never have presented themselves. So thank you for this discussion. Mark Brown, Lisa Nichols, Robert Zeff, it's been a pleasure, and we will continue. If you in the audience would like to suggest an ethical scenario, please go to my website, jonasandgoldson.com, and get in touch. And if you have a compelling idea, we will certainly take it up in a future episode. If you are a Grappling with the Gray member, please use the community link to participate in an open forum discussion that will continue momentarily. If you're not a member, please go to gwtg.live. gwtg.live. You can sign up for a free 30-day trial and enjoy member benefits. Please join us again next week when another panel takes up another question to grapple with the gray.